Good evening and welcome back to the channel. We're going to be discussing further interesting stories that are both weird and wonderful with me, Strange Bones. And as you know, we are jumping between countries and looking at different things. And today we are moving on to a new country. And in doing so, we are going to see if we can find out some new and interesting cryptids and ghosts to keep us awake at night. Now, as we progress into our new place, we need to have a very brief look at what we can call the history of the country, just to give us a little bit of a background, a little bit of a setting, something to see the wheres and the whys, and how it might be that the mythology and stories has come to pass. So in order to begin, we are doing Portugal, and we are going to, hey him, we are going to start up with a quick look at the sort of area. Now, as we know, Portugal is a very long and thin sort of a country. It has wonderful weather and very fertile soils, but it has the difficulty, shall we say, in that it's one of those countries that has always been between two major powers. And of course, when it comes to commanding trade routes and what have you, that made it a very nice country to own. And of course, that meant for a very long time it was indeed owned by other people. And it was only in the 12th century that it became an independent kingdom. And then thereafter, of course, it became quite a hugely powerful kingdom in the European world. And during the age of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, it was absolutely at the forefront, shall we say, of many of the great explorations, mostly because they were among the greatest sailors of their time. And even though the discoveries were very often attributed to other countries, particularly Spain, we need to realize that, for example, the great Spanish queen, who did many of the great discovery things, well, obviously not herself, but she was actually Portuguese and married into the Spanish kingdom. So the use of the great sailors is naturally something that would have been turned to, because it was at a time when most people believed the earth was flat and you would very likely sail off the edge. It was a terrifying thing, and few were brave enough to sail the open oceans, but the Portuguese sailors certainly were. Now, what it means is that because of their very, very long history, we know that a great deal of different influences came in to the country, bringing varying cultures and varying styles and things. And of course, because the land itself was particularly good for crops and things. It was a valuable bit of land. So we can say that um, they had a sufficiency of um, battles and wars and things that happened on their soil, fertile ground for all sorts. So we're going to begin then with the ghosts of Portugal. And there's quite a few places around from varying ages um, that we can have a quick look at and consider. Um, the country varied in its religious profile over the years. There were times when it was a Muslim country, there were times when it was an incredibly strongly Christian country. There were Jewish influences in certain places, and so on. And this added varying influence to all the different sort of things that turned up, shall we say. I see that Vlogs has joined us on the live. Livy was there for a second and disappeared. Hey, Springbok. Hey, Dees. Welcome, welcome. But we're going to start off with Sanatorio de Valongo, which this was basically a hospital, and it was particularly a tuberculosis hospital, which at the time was obviously a very serious issue for um, a lot of Europe, actually. Uh, Medicine was still in its infancy in dealing with a lot of diseases and such like. So really and truly, if we are honest, if you went to a tuberculosis hospital, you went there to die. And of course, this particular sanatorium, now abandoned, which was around for a very long time, is said to be haunted by the spirits of its former patients. And you can go there and visit the abandoned sanatorium. Um, and there's some very creepy videos that I managed to find in my research where there's definitely something in there. So we have a strong start on the ghosts. Then, of course, going back a bit further in history, you've got Quinta da Juncosa, which is a wonderful estate, but with a very tragic story around. Hey there, Double. Hey there. All kinds of letters. And Ali, YK Ali, welcome, welcome, welcome. So basically what happened is that the baron of this estate say that he went a little bit nuts and murdered his wife and children and then committed suicide. And this is very much in keeping with a lot of the stories from right around the world as to how ghosts might appear or become to be. Tragedy and murder and violence are definitely right up there at the top. So it is said that even today, the sounds of the wife and children, and possibly you might even get to see the baron in the estate. Another very sad one, which again, tragedy, which causes ghosts. You have the Castellino de São João de Estoril, where there is a castle on top of a cliff, and apparently a little girl fell from the cliff and died tragically, and now, of course, roams the grounds of the castle. And if you go there, it's said that if you're lucky, you will get to see her. She, of course, is quite a nice little ghost, unlike some others. At the Beau Séjour Palace in Lisbon, of course, many of the great palaces around Europe have got their necessary ghosts, I suppose you can say. Hey, Pri. Um, Many visitors and employees at the castle in Lisbon, which is a truly ancient city. It's a wonderful, wonderful place with many old buildings and beautiful architecture. And of course, at the palace, um, objects move and bells ring, which is an interesting one because usually actual movement of things and what have you is not common with ghosts. Usually it's just a seeing or hearing. So these seem to be quite strong ghosts. Hey, Calvin, welcome, welcome. So absolutely, um, that's an interesting uh, historical collection. I don't know if anybody would like to join me. You are more than welcome, Calvin. If you want to join in, you would be. Let me throw a couple of invites out if you fancy joining in the chats. You're more than welcome and give your opinions. Hey, girl, Tetwa. Um, but yeah, then of course in Faro there's the Leith Theatre, where a dancer who committed suicide is said to still dance on the stage, and at night you can hear her footsteps and sometimes on occasion even see her dance, which is quite beautiful in its creepy kind of way. So yeah. Then, of course, one which I find very interesting is Mafra Convent. Now, most ghost stories do say that. No problem, Calvin. Yeah, no problem. Would I like to go to a place like this? Oh, hell yes. I've been to many haunted places. It's something I do very much enjoy. And in fact, Mafra Convent, particularly because usually holy ground is a place that would keep ghosts away. But apparently not in this case, because it's haunted not only by a number of the workers who died in the construction of the convent, but there is a headless captain whose spirit haunts the grounds and has often been seen. So apparently, certain ghosts aren't affected by holy ground or holy things. It's a convent after all. Another great one, which comes from quite a while back, from the days of slavery, is Al Mauro Castle, where there was a princess that fell in love with a Moorish slave, um, and owing to the varying things, she lost her love and died as a result or committed suicide. It's not entirely clear. Would I get scared? Um, it's an interesting thing actually that most times that I've encountered ghosts, it hasn't been that scary at all. Um, I found that usually they're just a little sad and a little tragic. The only times that I've actually been scared where uh, it's been something that I think possibly was more than just a ghost, and it was something that actually became aggressive in some way. Whereas ghosts, they're just there to be seen. I've certainly had a few good jump scares. When I went to one of the haunted hospitals in Joburg, Kempton Hospital, um, we were followed down a corridor by children playing with a ball, and you could hear their running feet and laughter and the ball bouncing. And I got to admit, I jumped pretty hard on that one, but it wasn't that scary. But entities and things, yeah, that's a different story. That becomes a lot more creepy. And when we get onto the cryptids, perhaps we'll find some commonalities to the South African cryptids that we did in a previous live. And if we do, yeah, we'll talk about that and possible things that might be out there. So we shall see. But ghosts, by and large, not really a big problem. I'm glad to say, at least not for me. Um, Beyond the jump scare. Hey, fair. Um, so yeah, and guys, if anyone else wants to join in on this, absolutely do. Just drop me a note in the comments and I'll add you in. Calvin says he would bring a Glock and a Bible. You know, in terms of ghosts, I'm not sure the Glock would help, but in most cases, it seems that a Bible certainly would. Any kind of holy item in a lot of the different cultures and religions around the world. Religious items certainly do seem to help. In our last live, we spoke about Saudi Arabia. Um, I was inspired by the Emperor's son who just joined us now. And they have some fabulous, creepy things out there, of course. And yeah, they absolutely say that prayer and, well, the Quran in that case, as it's a Muslim uh, country, absolutely, definitely something you don't go out without type thing. I'm doing great there, Emperor's son. It's a fabulous day today. Little chilly, I've got to say, for South Africa. Uh, the weather is not doing the toes any good at all. But yes, let's go on through our list of haunted places. We haven't got too many yet. One which, let's face it, I'm going to throw this out there as being a guaranteed haunted place. And this is something which comes up in other countries. I know in France there's a number. I have a feeling there's some in Great Britain. But yes, Spain has, and of course Portugal, is the Capel dos Ossos, which literally translates as the Bone Chapel. And this comes from a time when um, space was not necessarily at a premium, but of course, veneration of the dead and such was important. And in the area, in the chapel where they would put their dead, the walls are lined with bones, human bones, from, I suppose, those that served the chapel. And I suppose over the centuries they add up. So just in and of itself, it's solidly creepy with human remains making up the walls. But a lot of people will say that the ghosts of those who were there absolutely do hang around, and you can see them in there, which is pretty impressive. I do really enjoy that as a creepy type thing. Um, that's another place. Yeah, I would like to visit that. Absolutely, fully creepy though. So no doubt in my mind that one's right up there. So I think that ghost-wise. Hey there, how you doing, sir?
Sure, you're right.
Good, good, good. Uh,
Good, good.
so glad
Thank
you
you.
can join us. Um, this is an interesting one, and I think a bit of a halfway between the one that we had last with Saudi Arabia, which is very much a Muslim country from a long way back, which interestingly had certain of the cryptids, at least, that echo some of the cryptids in South Africa, which I found very interesting because, by and large, as a country, the Muslim presence in South Africa is quite recent historically. So there wouldn't have been an influence much in terms of the sort of view of the cryptids, I think, in South Africa. And hopefully we'll find in Portugal something similar, which in their history there's been both a very strong Muslim influence and a very strong Christian influence. And of course, it has a very old history. So hopefully, we find interesting things to talk about here. I don't know. What do you think? Are we likely to find something good? Um, Now, as we go on with our interesting ghosts, we definitely are finding a theme along the lines that it's tragedy and death that bring various ghostly activity. And besides specific buildings where there are particular ghosts, there are certainly a number of battlefields, particularly in the north, and along what is, I suppose, the main road route through Portugal, because that would have been the varying powers on either side that would have come down or gone up, where the wars would have happened and where the major castles and things are. And it's said that there are a couple of battlefields where you absolutely will find haunted um, haunted areas and such, um, to to satisfy any ghostly requirements. But of course, that's not the only things that we can find uh, in terms of strange things. And one of my particular interests in following on with all of these is also those other paranormal or supernatural type things that will fit to that. Oh, we just got a question here. Have I ever been in the Castle of Good Hope? Now, we mentioned the castle when we did South Africa. Absolutely full of interesting ghosts and things. And I have not had the privilege of going into the castle, not even during the daytime. We know about the female ghosts that haunts a tunnel between the castle and one of the other buildings, and of the soldiers that absolutely move around in the grounds there. It's one of the very famous haunted buildings in South Africa. So, absolutely an interesting place. And buildings, especially old buildings, do seem to attract ghosts. So, and yes, as the Emperor's Son has pointed out, it happens at specific times of year. And we see that with ghosts generally, that there are times, usually on the anniversary of whatever caused them to be uh, dead or whatever like that. So certainly you do get that. And this is true, especially with the ghosts in Portugal as well, that when you're talking about the particular time of their death, um, that's when you will encounter most likely that ghost. So, for example, when you're talking about the dancer um, in the place in Lisbon, I think it was. Did we say it was Lisbon? We said it was Lisbon. Yes, we did. Um, there absolutely was a case that you will see her dance. Yeah, no, Faro. Sorry, my mistake there. Um, in Faro, the Leith Theatre, that's where you will see her on her anniversary more than anything else, which makes sense. Um, it seems that you can see the little girl that fell from the cliff in Castellanino de São João do Estoril pretty much at any time of the year. She just hangs around. It's harder with some of the others because places like the Mafra Convent and the Capela dos Ossos, obviously you had a lot of people that died at different times of the uh, of the year, so you'll get a fair number of different ghosts at different times, I think. So that of course makes it more general in your timing, I suppose. But nevertheless, I see we had one of the guys try and join us, and unfortunately, it didn't seem to connect, which is rather sad. But do comment, You're most welcome. And thank you for being with us, Claudio and Lena and such. But yes, now if we're going to jump across from ghosts and things to cryptids, we have a number of very interesting ones that certainly do seem to link to ghosts, starting with Don Sebastião, who was a king who disappeared. Now, it's not really known what happened to him. We assume he died. However, on foggy mornings in the area where the battle occurred, he's said to reappear. But unlike most ghosts, he appears to be a very real person. So it's not that he appears ghost-like, but rather that he just seems to be a person that will then suddenly disappear, which is quite an interesting sort of crossover. Another cryptid type, which is very interesting. We have our first dragon for the places that we've been looking at. And of course, that is the Coca, which is a female dragon. I'm not sure why it matters that it's specifically female, but according to the legend, and this is something that turns up with a great many female cryptids, it seems, she's after children. So if you're a child wandering around where you shouldn't, the Coca might snatch you away. Another very interesting one is actually a category rather than a specific, which is the Maura, which are a kind of enchanted women. Something a bit like a mermaid in a way, but associated specifically with the eve of Sajal, where they are seen combing their hair with a golden comb, and if approached correctly may guide you to hidden treasure, or in some stories, if you are not doing things in the way that you ought to, they may very well guide you to your death. I find that very interesting. Another rather cool cryptid, at least, that comes out of Portugal is the manticore, which, as we know, is a famous European cryptid now, but seems to have originated in Portugal, which is a kind of a lion, well, a lion's body at least, with a scorpion's tail and a man's head, which is said to be very wise and can lead you to treasures and wisdom, but at the same time, if you piss it off, it'll kill you, bluntly. And the other rather interesting one is a wyvern. Now, what I find very interesting is that actually in European cryptology, I suppose, there is a big difference between a wyvern and a dragon, and many of our favorite dragons in modern movies are not actually dragons at all, because in the proper sense of it, apparently, dragons have 4 legs, or 2 legs, 2 arms type thing, and wings separately, whereas wyverns only have back legs, so 2 legs, and wings, which makes them slightly more bird-like. But wyverns also have a kind of poisonous stinger. So it's interesting that these things have popped up within the Portuguese kind of culture. Now, as we move on, they have their semi-dinosaur type cryptids, which is a giant lizard-like creature in the Minho River region called the arganhão, which apparently lives in the water and will eat you if it can. They do have their version of the South American chupacabra in the form of the beast of Fies, which eats cattle, but is some kind of a oversized cat. Possibly, I suppose, a carryover from a saber-tooth tiger or something. I don't know. There is, however, again, halfway between cryptid and ghost, which is the ghost cobra, which is said to live along the river Cavado in the city of Barcelos. And what's really interesting is that it is a semi-ghost-like snake, transparent, and it was as recently reported seen as 1990s. So there's one that stood the test of time. We also, of course, has the ghost snake of the Arabes, which apparently came out of the river near the town during a drought looking for fresh water, and is said to be of huge length, and it ensconced itself in the fountain and has stayed there ever since. It was seen going in. Now, one of the guys asked earlier if I've ever been worried about ghosts, and not so much, but now here's one that absolutely would terrify me, and it's a cryptid that comes from the Azores, which of course are Portuguese islands, where they have the giant alien spiders. They are said to be huge, oversized spiders that are semi-ghostly. So partly ghosts, partly not. And I got to admit, I wouldn't be happy by a giant ghost spider right there off. But we come across something which may or may not have had an influence in our good friend J.R.R. Tolkien with The Lord of the Rings, because they have a version of an ent, a tree-type humanoid that lives in the mountain region of Portugal, and as early as the 1960s was seen. So right there. They also have their own version of Nessie, which is a horned dinosaur-like creature in the Lagoa Esquira, near the top of the Estrela Mountains, these mountains of the stars. So that's very interesting. And then, of course, you have varying bird-like creatures, which makes sense because there's a lot of stories in many mythologies about giant birds that we know are based in truth. So absolutely, there's that. There is a kind of lion creature, which may or may not be a giant lion that is now extinct. And there is even a kind of zebra-like creature, which is also said now to be extinct. So there's a lot of cryptids to go along with the ghosts in Portugal that you can find all over the place. And I think we should have a look at one of the particular ones, which personally I rather enjoy, in that it gives us a certain amount of generality to what kind of ghosts we can expect there. And when you're talking the top haunted places, we absolutely have to have a look at the hospital, for example, where you had a number of patients. It was actually built not terribly long ago, in 1910, and it had around 350 people at the time, despite the fact that it only had a capacity for about 50. And when this occurred, most of the people that were there died. So you find this very common in places such as plague hospitals around Europe. Even in America, there are certain plague hospitals where a lot of the people that were admitted, they didn't have any chance of survival, and they all died as a result. So that's not surprising at all. The buildings that are there are now mostly windowless and partly boarded up, and certainly fairly decrepit. It's not that big as a place, but as you walk through the halls, you can hear the cries of pain and the moans of the patients slowly dying in there. And as I said, it fits to the sort of mythos of ghosts, what causes ghosts, in as much that it has a lot of tragedy and pain with the understanding that that's what leaves a ghost. Certainly, sadness seems to be a primary cause, and then on the other side, as we see at the Patio de Carrasco in Lisbon, violence and anger. There was a chap there by the name of Luis Antonio Alves dos Santos, who was the last official executioner of Portugal, and legend had it that there was a tunnel underground leading from the patio to the Limoeiro prison, which is next door. And it was used so that the executioner could move from where he stayed to the prison to carry out his duties without being seen. And he executed a great number, and the prison itself, of course, is haunted by many of those that were executed, but apparently the mental weight, shall we say, of all that he did eventually drove him mad, and he died. And they say that you can still hear the tormented screams of Luis from the horror of all the death that he caused if you go there. So, very, very possibly one of the creepiest and very, very sad in many ways. Now, as we know, in the past, there were a number of, shall we say, dubious ways of dealing with political prisoners. And one of those things that is said to have been done on occasion, which was a particularly horrible way to die, was walling people up. It's happened in a couple of places around Europe, and it generally happened to people of somewhat importance, at least, I'll say that. And in the same building in Faro, the Leith Theatre, where the dancer hung herself and still dances for whatever reason, there was a Napoleonic soldier who was walled up in one of the walls, and whose body was eventually found very, very much later down the century, and his ghost still wanders around. But again, it fits to the almost guaranteed view that um, it's something dark or sad that brings a ghost. Whether or not that is always the case is, I don't think, always true. I have seen happy ghosts once, but only once. So who knows? Um, Looking at the other things that I find interesting, that they are less common or believed in among the cryptids, though you absolutely do get in some of the places shadow people. And this goes back to what we found in South Africa and what we found in Saudi Arabia, which I find very, very interesting, that shadow people seem to turn up a lot. And they're described in much the same way everywhere, that they are basically a black or shadowy humanoid-ish person, shall we say, very often with burning eyes or red eyes. And as we saw in the live we did in Saudi Arabia, um, they call them the jinn, and they are considered there to be very much real people, just not human people. And in the Quran they are mentioned, and in much of what is said, they are considered to still be under religious law, and they can be believers or unbelievers. So they can be good or bad or neutral. And it's interesting to find that the same sort of creatures are seen, at least, though often described differently, or given a different ascribing as to what they are, but nevertheless described the same in so many other countries, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So, for the sake of it at the moment, we have to say either they are the echo of a ghost, perhaps, or they are, as um, the Muslim ascribes them, they are a kind of jinn which live in desolate places, especially. Whether or not they are, I suppose it's very hard to tell. Um, I have certainly known many people who say they have seen them in South Africa. There are a great many stories that you will find online even now, and quite modern, where people say they have seen them in Saudi Arabia, and now we find them again in Portugal, which makes me start to wonder if these are not, as is said, another race of semi-corporeal beings that live alongside us. Um, Partly paranormal? Is that something that we can say? Not sure. Um, Another very interesting story that goes along the ghostly side of things, which has the most beautiful name of the Quintas das Lagrimas, the Tears Manor in Coimbra. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, very old and the most gorgeous environment. But there was a famous love affair between Pedro, who was the heir to the throne, and Ines de Castro, who was his wife's maid. And obviously, this was something which was absolutely not allowed, fully verboten. And there's a lot of history around this. And of course, King Alfonso IV disapproved, because therefore, um, if it had carried on, it would have brought scandal and had problems for Pedro, who was supposed to be the heir to the throne and was married, to be fair. And he had Ines de Castro murdered, and the place Quintas das Lágrimas is where she was murdered and where apparently she cried as she died. And a fountain now exists there, which is said to be her tears, the Fonte de Lágrimas, the tears fountain. And strangely enough, there is a weird kind of red algae that only seems to grow in this particular fountain there, or at least in this area. And legend has it that this is the remains of her blood that stains the bottom of the fountain, which it's got all the sort of romance and style of a good story, but at the same time is terribly tragic. Another set, which again is more ghost and cryptid, though, is the Casa das Pedras, which is an amazing sea-inspired house. The walls being covered with shells and stones from the sea, and it is said to have all sorts of strange things where strange noises and figures can be seen and heard in the house, though the current residents deny it. Maybe they've gone quiet, or maybe they're hiding it. I'm not entirely certain. It's certainly a thing to question, I suppose. I don't know if we can ever know the truth if as it's a private house and they don't allow people to be in there. So there's that. But nevertheless, it is a fascinating set of hauntings, and of course, with it comes again references to the shadow people, which is becoming quite a theme. Another thing which we must briefly touch on, of course, is the topic of witches. Now, as we know very well, witches in South Africa may or may not be evil, depending on how you view it. Witches in Saudi Arabia are absolutely considered evil. But what about in Portugal? Well, the witch trials that went around Europe were not as big in Portugal. There were a couple, and there was certainly between 1559 and 1560 a couple of executions that did happen. The Portuguese Inquisition did try a number of people for witchcraft over the years, but very few were actually executed. So witchcraft wasn't something that was that big a worry, it seems, to the Portuguese. The Lisbon witch trial, which is one of their most famous, saw the execution of 6 women, but by and large, it wasn't that serious. Interestingly, though, and unlike in many places, despite the stories, most of Europe did not burn witches. They were executed by other means. But in Portugal, they certainly will. They were burnt at the stake. And in 1933, there was a witch, or a woman claimed to be a witch, and said to also be possessed, who was burnt alive. And ironically, her name was Arminda de Jesus. So there we go. How much has this affected? I would say by and large that in Portugal, witches generally were actually respected and not terribly hated in any way. In Portuguese, they are known as bruxa, which is similar to the Spanish, of course. By and large, there is a bit of a blend between traditional witchcraft and the Christian faith, even, where things have grown together a bit. And I think even to this day, there is a fair amount of belief in the magical, at the very least, around Portugal and outside of the European witch craze that caused the trials, pushed on especially with the famous Malleus Maleficarium and such. I don't think it made a major impact in Portugal at all. So by and large, they've had a fair decent run in Portugal, shall we say, but there are mixed views on witches. There are those that are considered to be fairly good and for the most part are left alone, as it were, but you also get the evil ones, which are said to worship the devil. And of course, in that case, they are absolutely considered to be evil and to be avoided. There isn't a lot said about it. Much of witchcraft and the pagan beliefs in Portugal are not well documented, I think. I think it's partly because Christianity as a religion has been strong there for a lot of the history where serious records were kept. So there is that kind of a difficulty in finding more, shall we say. Hey, Perry. But yes, you had times and places, and there are one or two legends of witches in Portugal that were famous for their abilities or powers and what have you. There was the Witch of Aruda, for example, one who was known for her amazing healing practices, which ties with the idea that witchcraft and occult is not considered to be as bad as all that. Though there have been one or two others that, as I say, were said to be possessed by the devil and therefore an evil version and were dealt with summarily, as it were. So we've definitely got a whole collection of cryptids. We've got a whole collection of ghosts, a lot of really interesting and shall we say famous ghosts all over Portugal, and along with that, we've definitely got a few interesting cryptids which definitely made their way into other parts of Europe, such as the Wyvern. Though dragons are found in varying forms in many cultures all over the world, so I don't think we can claim dragons as an origin particularly to Portugal, but nevertheless, they have their cryptids which have similar cryptids in other places. They have their Nessie, of course. They don't have a Bigfoot, it seems, but they do have an Ent. So there's that at least. As I say, it may have been an influence on good old Tolkien. We don't know. I suppose it's something that we will never know for certain, but nevertheless, it's an interesting possibility. Um, I don't know what you guys think about all of that. The commonalities that we are finding as we go country to country are definitely the most interesting part. Ghosts do seem to fit that base category that we have discussed before, that it has to have been um, a living being that has died, and almost always in either tragic or violent circumstances. There are occasionally ghosts of animals, but it seems to be very, very, very seldom. And when it happens, it's usually in conjunction with a human ghost. So, where you have a ghost rider, um, the horse is with the rider, of course. So, there is that, um, which makes it difficult to really say whether or not um, animal ghosts are a thing in a proper sense, but humans certainly. And what we could argue is that the animal ghosts are merely an extension in many ways, at least from what we've seen so far, because there are a number of ghost stories where the ghosts are still riding their motorbikes or driving in their cars. So, or the car has crashed but is seeable. Uh, Perhaps it is merely an extension of the ghost itself. But we still have many countries to look at around the world, so perhaps we will find otherwise, both with cryptids and with ghosts. There is absolutely a lot still to go and look at before we can um, decide anything in this regard. But one thing we can absolutely say, that ghosts are something that people do believe uh, in all three of the countries we have looked at so far. And cryptids seem to be a thing as well, but in very different forms for the most part, except for our our happy little shadow people. So we're going to have to follow the line of the shadow people as well as the ghosts quite carefully to see if they turn up in that way. Um, it will be an interesting discussion, I think. Noam Levy, hey, welcome, welcome. How much can we say about Ghost Sense so far? Well, we have discovered that um, one almost certain way to get a ghost is through suicide. Suicide is absolutely a strong cause for ghosts. Um, Unfair murder is absolutely a strong way to to get a ghost to appear. Hey, Oceana Spam. Um, and then, of course, severe tragedy where people have lost their lives in a sudden and unexpected way. Those are our top methods, if you will, to get ghosts. We know from most of the haunted buildings, it's where people have died unfairly, either through serious disease or in much pain. Battlefields, absolutely. And one thing which I find to be greatly amusing is that there are not that many stories of ghosts in graveyards. It seems that unless they're very old graveyards, um, or if the graveyards has very specific connections, uh, graveyards are places where you don't get ghosts. And it makes sense, because unless things have gone tragically wrong, uh, you don't die in a graveyard. So it looks like if you're planning on doing ghost hunting, you have to look at roads, hospitals, houses, and places where people are likely to die. Um, And that's certainly been consistent no matter the culture, the main religions, or the place. Um, so ghosts are fairly consistent. Um, when it comes to our shadow people, the only major consistency is the description. It's ascribed different reasons for being. Some consider them actually to be a ghost. Others say they are demons. Others say they are jinn. But there is a commonality in description in that they are shadowy, usually burning eyes, and when not trying to change shape, are humanoid at least, and only partly physical, shall we say, which gives our parallel planes idea absolutely a possibility that they are only somewhat and sometimes in this world and other times elsewhere. So maybe. Otherwise, the cryptids themselves, our only commonalities is in the reptiles and the big cats, by and large, which fits to the idea of stories that have grown from animals now extinct, such as the old saber-toothed cats, which were said to be way bigger than the modern big cats. And of course, giant versions of reptiles that, of course, reptiles we absolutely know exist, and you can absolutely get very large crocodiles and such around the world. So there is that at least. So yes, I think we will wrap up Portugal there, and in our next one we will look at the possibility of another location to see, and we'll see where we can go and what we can say. So thanks for being part of everything. Do join, like, subscribe, and be a part of the chat, send comments, and yeah, come and join in and be a guest on the channel and chat and give your opinion, whether you're for or against. I would love to hear from you. So um, with that said, have a fabulous evening, and we will see you in the next.